China, if you had to focus not on kind of reaction to crises, but on strategy, on what the United States believed, what our administration believed was the biggest challenge that we faced, would have been at the very top of that list, was in all of the documents that we put out early in our administration, described as kind of the main focus of our foreign policy. And the president had a particular way of going about the China challenge. Here, I do give some credit to the first Trump administration. I think they properly diagnosed the challenge the United States faced as competition with China. We sort of adopted and continued that framework. Where I think we really part ways is tactically how we go about addressing that challenge. For President Biden, it started with getting our own house in order in the United States, making the necessary investments in our own sources of strength, our manufacturing base, our infrastructure, our lead in the key technologies that would define the future. And if you go through the landmark pieces of legislation, Infrastructure Act, CHIPS Act, the IRA, which made these massive investments in clean energy, among other things, the president was trying to lay a foundation of strength that would obviously first and foremost benefit us at home and restore and revitalize our economy, but also lay the groundwork for a strong position in the world and for this competition with China. Second, and this is where the previous administration and now the current administration have a totally different view, the president believed that if you're going to compete with a near peer, which is how we describe China, a country that is nearly our peer in terms of the main indicators of strength, power, you want to have your partners and allies alongside you and not either on the sidelines or neutral or, God forbid, on the side of your adversary. And so the president went about restoring our alliances with key countries, obviously in Europe, NATO countries being at the top of that list, but also in China's own region, the region that we share, the Indo-Pacific, the Japanese and the Koreans, building stronger ties with countries that sometimes hedge between the U.S. and China, like Vietnam or Indonesia, stronger ties with countries in our own hemisphere, and not ceding ground to China in places that we sometimes describe as the global south, like Africa, where China had sort of had the run of the place throughout the Trump administration because they just didn't prioritize those places. We decided we needed to compete with China everywhere and that we would bring a unique U.S. asset, these relationships that China does not have to bear in that competition. That was the strategy, and it was focused on making sure that we kept key regions of strategic importance secure and kept China from coercing our friends or, God forbid, the United States, kept a lead in sensitive technologies, made sure that we had the strongest economy in the world and not China. And if you look at all of those indicators from the day we took office to the end of the administration, I think the record stands up really well. Very few people now are talking about China, having a lead over the United States in these key technologies, AI, quantum, that are going to determine, who leads in the future. Very few people anymore are talking about the Chinese economy surpassing that of the United States until we got into this very messy trade war situation, which is now calling into question U.S. economic leadership. The record that we handed off to the Trump administration, I think, was a very strong position for the United States in this competition with China.
So what do you think is the realistic aspiration that we should have for how America proceeds in the global economy? There are many who say, Trump has jacked up and continues to jack up tariff rates against China with this notion that we should reshore all manufacturing, make iPhones, clothes, everything that is currently made in China here. There are many economists, business people who say that that's a fantasy, and not just for the fact that it takes a long time to build these plants and they've all been closed, but also just the entire operation that happens in China, from human capital to whatever is all over in China. Where do you think where was President Biden's view on the kind of steady state that we wanted to aspire to for China and the United States, and what is realistic now? And in that context, what's your take on all these tariffs?
Yeah, so President Biden, I think, had a very strong view borne out by the policy approach he took and by the state of the economy when he left office, that the United States needed to restore and revitalize some of the key sources of our economic strength that had waned and that had atrophied, in part because there had been this consensus around, the sort of purest possible free trade system, network of agreements, multilateral and bilateral, being made all around the world that both Democrats and Republicans believed in for a while. And I think what everybody missed, although frankly not President Biden, who spoke a lot about this in the 2020 campaign, was that those agreements, while maybe raising the level of overall prosperity in the United States and other places, when you look at a measure like GDP growth, actually had really damaging effects on certain communities within the United States and within other countries, and that those effects were not mitigated enough by policy, that the government didn't say, yes, maybe overall this approach that we're taking is good for the overall size of the U.S. economy, but the way it's distributed and the way the benefits flow is actually damaging some communities, and we have to do something to address that. So because of that, large swaths of the country sort of turned against this consensus in favor of, sort of free trade everywhere as almost an article of faith, and decided they didn't support that anymore. And that happened sort of late in the Obama administration. It was a big part of why I think President Trump was elected, a big part of why how he governed in the first term. And I think on some level, President Biden shared the view that the U.S. had to do a better job of looking after our own economy and our own people, even as we inevitably have trading relationships with countries in the rest of the world. So what did that mean? It meant an overriding focus on seeing if we could bring back manufacturing. It meant an overriding focus on these key areas, sensitive, critical technologies that the United States could not just cede that ground to other countries that could maybe make them more cheaply in some cases, that we needed to bring a lot of that work back home. It did not mean for President Biden that everything that the United States consumed had to be made here. That is a kind of, a totally unrealistic vision of how the global economy can work. There are certain things that cannot be made here, certain products that can't be grown here. So the United States needs trading relationships with the rest of the world, but we also need supply chains on the things that matter most, not to be dependent on countries that could end up being our adversaries, like China. And so President Biden prioritized, again, in these critical areas, technologies and critical infrastructure and other supply chains that needed to be secure, reordering the U.S. economy and our relations in the world to protect them. He preserved many, if not most, of the tariffs that President Trump put in place during the first term, but went about building stronger economic ties short of free trade agreements with as many countries as we could that were strategic partners of the United States. And I think to a large extent for us and for those countries, it was working. If you look at the performance of the U.S. economy when President Biden left office, by every objective metric, it was strong. It was not perfect. There were challenges associated with having had high inflation and not brought prices down. So relatively high price level at the end of the Biden administration. I think that hurt quite a lot, frankly, in the 2024 election and campaign. But if you compare that situation to where we are now, where for the first time, maybe ever in modern history, the United States is being deeply questioned as a responsible steward of the global economy because we have decided to launch a trade war and then pause it and then negotiate about it and create this massive uncertainty about our economic relations with the world. We are calling into question the U.S. as the sort of organizer of the global financial system, which we've been forever, as a destination for capital, which we have been the most reliable destination for capital for as long as anybody can remember. And it's unclear how we undo this damage, because part of what is at issue here is the injection into a system where there was a high degree of uncertainty, of a lot of uncertainty. So even if these policies get reversed, the fact that we did this means that we could do it again and that we might do it again. And that uncertainty is not going to go away overnight, no matter what policies the administration pursues.
You've talked about publicly about, our work with Japan and Korea. I just want our listeners to kind of understand the implications broader than just the tariffs themselves, but the implications of our allies feeling animus towards us instead of a sense of collaboration, and how that could make people less safe.
Yeah, so look, if you buy the argument that the United States is better off having partners and allies in the world for the competition with China, for crises when they emerge, like the Ukraine crisis, better to have to address that, again, alongside other countries than to have to do it ourselves. If you accept that, and by the way, I don't know that the current administration does accept that. I think their basic view is that partnerships and alliances are things the United States contributes a lot to, and the countries that we partner and ally with get the benefits of, but that don't really benefit all that much, don't benefit us all that much. I see that very differently. But if you buy my argument, okay, when you go to those countries and say, you're our partner, you're our ally, we have these expectations of you that you'll be there for us, when we need you. But oh, by the way, we are also going to level the same tariff rate or a much higher tariff rate on you than on these other countries that are our adversaries. By the way, Russia was not on that tariff list. We don't trade much with Russia, so it wouldn't have had much of an impact one way or the other. But just as a symbolic matter, the notion that we're putting higher tariff rates against our closest friends and allies than we are against a country like Russia.
They put tariff rates on uninhabited islands, so if they're going to do that, they should do it with Russia.
And even leaving that stuff aside, which is obviously ridiculous, but maybe in the category of a mistake. I don't think leaving Russia off was a mistake. I don't know what signal they were trying to send by doing that. But it was sent. When we're going to Canada and Mexico, two of our very largest trading partners, our neighbors, countries from whose stability we benefit massively and from whose prosperity we benefit massively, and launch a trade war against them and threaten their territory, by the way, too. I mean, there is kind of open threats to Canadian territory by the current administration. Not purely joking about the fact that they would like Canada to be the 51st state. There are also some open threats to Mexican territory, at least if you believe these reports, that they are looking at the prospect of potential military action against cartels in Mexico. All of this stuff would have been totally beyond the pale in a different era. One of the biggest benefits of being the United States is you have a massive geographic advantage. You've got oceans on either side of you. So for a country to actually attack the United States as more than just a one-off like took place on Pearl Harbor or 9/11 requires a whole lot of military might and preparation and things that you can see coming very hard to execute. You've got countries on your borders, your northern border and your southern border, that are basically friendly countries to you, basically prosperous countries with whom you can trade. Why we would call those advantages into question, I don't understand.
Where do you think this trade war is?
Again, I think what will probably happen, although it's very hard to predict, and by the way, just predictions about how this administration is going to make policy are kind of a fool's errand, but I will answer your question because you asked it. I think ultimately a lot of this will end up with the administration backing off some of its most maximalist demands, and maybe there will be some deals announced with key countries. I think that's going to be very hard with some countries, by the way. I think the Europeans in particular are quite angry about the way they're being treated and will not go quietly into a deal with the United States. I think that's true of Canada as well.
And do you worry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but do you worry about the EU, Japan, Korea going to China or others and making their own deals and saying U.S. is being ridiculous, we got to band together?
Yeah, so here's what I say. I think some of these countries will ultimately make deals with the United States. I mean, the president is already signaling that when it comes to China, maybe he actually just wants to make a deal and get off of some of the very draconian policies that he's put into place. Just said that yesterday. And I think China has played this, unfortunately, reasonably smartly. They have withheld a bunch of things that they know that Trump administration wants. They were about to do a deal, by all accounts, to resolve the issue around TikTok and its operations in the United States. They paused that deal. They were on the cusp of agreeing to a sale of the Hutchison port in Panama to a U.S. entity, which is another thing, Panama, that the Trump administration is focused on. They paused that deal as well, like a $20 billion deal. They paused the purchase of a significant number of Boeing aircraft. I mean, I think they withheld all these things to use them as bargaining chips in a negotiation with the United States. And I think these are all things the president wants. They could put them on the table at almost no cost to China, and I think buy down some of the policies they don't like. And so I worry that they are going to be able to buy the administration off cheaply and maybe even ask for things that would be damaging to us in the process. Like, just say to the Trump administration, why don't you loosen a little bit some of the export controls on sensitive technologies that you've placed on us as part of this deal. And look, we're offering you all these things, and maybe we'll buy a bunch of agriculture products from you too. Big number, big headline. Maybe they say to the administration, why don't you just slow down your arms sales to Taiwan a little bit over the course of your first term. That would really help us get to yes and get to a deal. If they start getting concessions from the administration on things like that, that starts to look like a deal that is profoundly in China's interest, not very much in the U.S. interest. So I worry that that's where some of this is headed. And I worry, as you said, that countries in regions like Europe, which have been, I think, happily and heavily dependent on the United States for their security and for their prosperity over decades, are going to think again about whether they need to hedge, whether they need to have closer ties to China, at a time when we have been putting a lot into trying to get them to be less dependent on China for their economic relations.